Isn't the biggest issue here being the fact that Netanyahu and Israel overall has the support of the United States, which is, a major player in the global arena?
This is the problem, as you point out, because the violation is taking place. And so that would mean that they are complicit in genocide.
But the UN Security Council itself is biased, isn't it? I mean, they've got their own interests. Each country represented in the Security Council have their own interests as well. So they are not really going to take a proper action either.
The polarization of the Security Council means that certain conflicts go unaddressed because exactly that those particular countries are either engaging in proxy wars or that they have different alliances. So I would agree with you, and I think. And this is the problem.
I think when we look at both cases, Gaza and the Sri Lankan situation, Israel is saying that they are targeting militants or terrorists or Hamas. Sri Lanka has also been saying that there was no targeting of Tamil civilians, but it was targeting of the militants.
Not necessarily by committing genocide, as defined in Article 2 of the Convention, but it failed to prevent and punish the mass atrocity crimes that were targeted against an ethnic population.
Hello and welcome to another episode of On Fire here on Daily Mirror. I'm Easwaran, Rutnam. The situation in Gaza is going from bad to worse. We've seen reports from the UN saying that Gaza is probably now the hungriest place on earth. On the program today is a former Sri Lanka monitoring mission spokesperson and advisor and an independent expert on peacekeeping, Helen Olafsdottir. Helen is, of course, now still very much involved with the UN on an independent capacity, but she's been on the ground covering other conflicts as well, and she has been focusing a lot on Gaza now. So I thought I'll discuss the Gaza situation and maybe a few parallels with the situation in Sri Lanka. Hi, Helen. Welcome to the program.
Hey, nice to see you again.
Good to see you too, Helen. So, in my introduction, I was speaking about the situation in Gaza and how the UN is actually warning off almost the entire Gaza facing a famine. You have been following the situation in Gaza very closely. What is your take on what's going on there? I mean, there's a lot of talk from the media, from the international community, but very little action seems to be taking place and in giving a proper solution to this crisis.
Yes, I think it's one of those things that has, the Middle East has obviously been very disruptive, the situation in the Middle East for a long time. But there is a particular concern that this war that is now being carried out, in particular in Gaza, as well as the region, is going to have a spillover effect. But more importantly, for the United Nations and for the member states that are party, for example, to the Genocide Convention, there's a concern that this particular conflict is now at a place that it is not just a violation of international humanitarian law, but it is also a genocide, which means that all of these countries that are parties to the Genocide Convention have actually a legal obligation to prevent a genocide. And that means that it's not just punishing the perpetrators of genocide, but the Genocide Convention is very particular in saying that you need, as a party to the convention, to take any action possible to prevent the act of genocide. And just in the context of this, and it's important to remember that the International Court, the International Court has actually said very clearly, first of all, it's taken the case to be considered, and that means that now Israel is in court for a potential genocide. Now, of course, the ruling hasn't happened, but here it's very clear that they've made these provisional measures. Provisional measures are done because, of course, they can't do the ruling. It'll take about 2 years at least to do a ruling of this kind of scale, to rule whether it's a genocide or not. But exactly, the court able to issue these provisional measures because it's their calling for the prevention of genocide. It also calls for the adherence to international humanitarian law. And what's clear here is that Israel is not adhering to international humanitarian law when it comes to, for example, aid, access to aid. It's also, there's forced displacement. So there's various different pieces of the international humanitarian law that they're violating. But more importantly, there's also indications, and all experts, in terms of credible experts on genocide, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the United Nations have all come out to say this is genocide. So it's now up on the parties to the Genocide Convention, which means the member states, to do what is necessary to prevent it. But what we're seeing right now, very clearly, is that those actions are not taking place. Because normally what you would have is an attempt to have some kind of, at least at the very minimum, an arms embargo, but also potential sanctionings of those who are deemed responsible in government. And just linked to that is the Rome Statute, which is the International Criminal Court, which has actually indicted 2 members of the government already. I think there's preparations for more indictments against others in the government. And when you have 2 people in the Israeli government, one who's still in government, the defense minister has actually resigned, or was Gallant, is no longer in government. That doesn't mean that he's still not in court. But Netanyahu is very much now wanted by the International Criminal Court. That means that those countries who are parties to not just the Genocide Convention, but also the ICC, have an obligation to do the necessary to arrest Netanyahu if he comes to their jurisdiction, and again, to do anything in their power to prevent the carrying out of genocide.
Isn't the biggest issue here being the fact that Netanyahu and Israel overall has the support of the United States, which is, a major player in the global arena? And if the US is not taking the side of those calling for criminal action against Israel administration, those who recognize the situation in Gaza as genocide, how would this play out overall?
This is the problem, as you point out, because the violation is taking place. And so that would mean that they are complicit in genocide, that the United Nations are, according to law now, complicit in genocide. And of course, also to mention that the United States is not a party to the ICC. So they have no obligations, therefore. Sri Lanka is not in the ICC, by the way, either.
Yes.
So that means that, members of the Israeli government can travel to the United States without necessarily being under threat of being arrested. But I think the problem here is that it's about the international human rights. Well, first of all, it's about the world order as we know it, because these mechanisms were established, including by the United States after World War II, to precisely prevent these kinds of atrocities, the never again, to happen. So all of the mechanisms that were created after World War II, including the United Nations system and the International Court, is being undermined by one of the major founders. And so what we are finding ourselves right now, not just in the context of Gaza or Palestine or the conflict in the Middle East, is the entire world system as we know it. We are in a transition from a single polar world to a multipolar world, where you have many more actors who the hegemony is no longer there as we knew it. And so we're in a very difficult transition time. And of course, the Security Council in the United Nations is completely paralyzed when it comes to this particular conflict because of Russia and America in there. And so I would say that we're in a very difficult place. But that's not to say that precisely just because they've got the support of the United States, it just means that the United States makes itself complicit in the genocide.
Right. You mentioned Sri Lanka, and also you mentioned the United Nations Security Council. And this word genocide was something that was used when, in the final stages of the conflict. Even now, there are calls for investigations to be conducted on genocide that was committed in Sri Lanka as well. And the United Nations has been criticized of being, maybe backward, not really taking strong action on Sri Lanka at that time, and leaving room for incidents like what we saw back then to take place. And we're seeing the same situation now, even in Gaza as well. So the United Nations itself seems to be really powerless or not exercising the powers that it has.
So it's very interesting to look at the case of Sri Lanka because, of course, human rights atrocities were committed. And, out of that came, and I'm talking about the specific sort of the civil war that ended in 2008-9, and here we have, in particular, when we had people being put, forcibly displaced and put into what the welfare camps, which were concentration camps. A lot of the actions, not to mention extrajudicial killings, disappearances. I mean, these are clear war crimes. But out of this came, and I think that this was very much covered in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, but out of this came this whole understanding that the international community had in fact failed in Sri Lanka for protection of civilians. And, and of course, having this is a conflict that I know very well in detail. And so, of course, atrocities were committed on both sides. But what you have here is a government, a democratically elected government that has very specific obligations, which we need to consider. And so when the war was ending, it's quite clear that there was, I think, military restraint was not exercised necessarily. And I think that, again, the humanitarian access was, for example, in some cases limited, which is a violation of international humanitarian law. The population in some cases was being put into these camps. There was collective punishment in a way, and this is not also in line with international humanitarian law, the way in which it was carried out. So, I mean, I know that there was an attempt to distinguish combatants from civilians, but the way in which this was carried out was a collective threat to the Tamil population and made them vulnerable, right? And of course, this kind of mass detention, as I mentioned, is a collective punishment, even if it was an attempt to do screening, because some of these people, I am of the understanding, were in these camps for prolonged periods of time. It wasn't just a quick screening process. It was up to or more than a year in some cases, as I understand.
Yeah.
So the failure here by the government of Sri Lanka in terms of adhering to international law was, disproportionate force. That could be argued. Deliberately restricting humanitarian access, that's a clear crime, war crime. And again, being corralled into these militarized camps. I'm thinking Manic Farm, right, in Bavunia.
Yeah.
Where you strip away people's freedom and legal rights, and there's been no accountability, to my understanding, of what was carried out in those camps. And then you have the state targeting civilians. That this is another war crime when you target civilian based on their ethnicity. That's in this case the Tamils. And so even it raises serious concerns, right? Just in terms of ethnic persecution. Yeah. Even if the legal threshold for genocide would remain debated, right? And so, to my knowledge, I've not seen, but maybe you can correct me, Easwaran, because I've not seen an independent domestic investigations on these issues, or I think that the government has. At least the previous government that was very much involved in this particular the last phases of that particular war, have rejected completely international accountability.
Yeah, excessive government.
Despite there being credible evidence, right?
Yeah, So all governments in Sri Lanka since the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration have rejected international investigations.
Yeah.
They have
Yeah.
conducted their own inquiries, but we've not seen a solid outcome as yet. And I think when we look at both cases, Gaza and the Sri Lankan situation, Israel is saying that they are targeting militants or terrorists
Yeah.
or Hamas. Sri Lanka and has also been saying that there was no targeting of Tamil civilians, but it was targeting of the militants. Um,
Yeah.
but how do you? I mean, how can the international community and especially the UN, maybe get involved? Or what should have they done? What should they have done back in the Sri Lankan situation, and what should they be doing now in the Gaza crisis as well? Prevent civilians being targeted and holding these countries accountable when they say no, we're not targeting civilians, we're targeting terrorists or
Yeah.
rebels.
Yeah. So there is a few mechanisms in the UN that, first of all, the Secretariat itself is very much directed by the Security Council in how it can intervene. So it would have had to be taken up in the Security Council. I fear very much that because Sri Lanka was a very limited conflict within its borders, that it didn't get the international attention that it probably should have had at the time.
Yeah.
Because it was it was restricted. It had no possibility of any spillover effect. And let's not forget that, in 2001, after the 9/11, there was that whole campaign, the War on Terror.
Yeah.
And so the status of the Tamil Tigers was very much eroded by that particular campaign as they were put onto the terrorist list, both in the United States and later in the EU. So there was never going to be in that particular context, just from a legal perspective, you did not have equal, I suppose, groups vying for. What I'm more here interested in is the legality of how you treat the civilians, and because the combatants, first of all, the way in which it was described as they, just before some of the groups were actually gunned down. I mean, I remember that some of the people from the Peace Secretariat of the Tamil Tigers, or I think that the leader had been killed, but I think even Tamas Shalvan had been killed. But there was a group of people that wanted to surrender, but were not allowed to do so, and they called everybody, including the Norwegians. They called the ICRC. They called the United Nations to help the actual case of surrendering, and they did not manage to have anybody overseeing the surrendering process, and they were all gone down. Right. Again, another example of a war crime, no matter how you feel about the conflict in prior to that. So there's I think ultimately, so because I have thought about this a lot, having been obviously there as a impartial party to the conflict at the time, just trying to monitor ceasefire violations. But I mean, ultimately, Sri Lanka's actions and omissions in 2009, they do represent a kind of a systemic failure to uphold its obligations, even under the Genocide Convention, right? Because it not necessarily by committing genocide, as defined in Article 2 of the Convention, but it failed to prevent and punish the mass atrocity crimes that were targeted against an ethnic population. So there are elements within the convention that the Sri Lankan government has failed to adhere to, and of course this is compounded by impunity or denial and this can have a long-lasting consequence. And trust in the international system, trust in justice, even within Sri Lanka, the healing of a nation that needs to overcome these atrocities, that is questionable because there's been no recognition of the atrocities that were committed at the time.
But putting the Sri Lankan government aside, or even the Israeli government aside, obviously, they are not going to do what the world wants them to do, or what certain human rights groups are calling them to do. But again, it comes back to the fact that the United Nations, now in the Sri Lankan context, the UN panel back then also found the United Nations, the independent panel found the United Nations
Fair-
guilty, or they failed on the Sri Lankan situation. And now we see a similar situation happening again
Absolutely.
with Gaza. So, what's the point in having a UN body which seems to be powerless or toothless,
Yeah.
just issuing statements, calling out for certain actions, but nothing really concrete taking place?
Yeah, you could say the same about Rwanda,
Yes.
because in the case of Rwanda, you had member states that should have been aware of the threat of genocide, and no action was taken. I think the issue is I come back to the Security Council
Yeah.
because that's the authority, that's the body that can authorize an action. No other body in the UN can authorize any kind of, in particular, sort of, for example, a peacekeeping operation or a serious action. It has to be enshrined in a resolution. And this is where I think it failed. And I think this is why the Human Rights Up Front was established, precisely to bring the leaders of the UN system together to go systemically through the ongoing conflicts and potential atrocities being committed, to flag to the Security Council the potential of these kinds of violations. In the case of Sri Lanka,
But the UN Security Council itself is biased, isn't it? I mean, they've got their own interests. Each country represented in the Security Council have their own interests as well. So they are not really going to
yes.
take proper action either.
So it has worked in some cases, I would say in Africa, for example, in where you've had peacekeeping operations being deployed quite quickly to soothe or freeze a conflict. Security Council resolutions in the case of where you have, for example, Israel, is completely meaningless because it has the political coverage by the United States. So absolutely, the polarization of the Security Council means that certain conflicts go unaddressed because exactly that those particular countries are either engaging in proxy wars or that they have different alliances. So I would agree with you, and I think. And this is the problem. I mean, a lot of people are having an issue with the fact that you have a Security Council with where members of the old structure of the world have a veto. I mean, imagine, for example, that India has not a permanent place in the Security Council, and yet it's over 1 billion people. The Security Council is a mechanism that comes out of World War II. And so, and those who won World War II. I mean, this is the mechanism that was put in place there, and it's outdated. It doesn't work anymore in the context of peace, and that's why imagine we are seeing now, for example, in Africa, 8 coups. This is the situation in the world right now. We've never seen so many active conflicts since World War II. So yes, the mechanism is outdated. It needs reforming. But there's also with the current administration in the US, you could see potential withdrawing from the UN over time by the United States. If this kind of attitude in the United States administration continues, I wouldn't be surprised if they ultimately just withdraw from it. But God forbid they do, because actually the one thing that is in the UN that does work is the humanitarian wing.
Right.
The political might be paralyzed, but there is nothing else in the world that has the kind of collective power to address and react to humanitarian crisis. There's nothing else. This is the problem. The UN is not functioning on the political level, but we've got nothing else. We haven't got the new system. We don't know what a new system will look like. And members of the General Assembly are very much arguing that we need the reform and we need more democracy in the Security Council that would allow for more actions to be taken, including, for example, in Gaza. So yes, I would agree with you.
Should there be maybe regional bodies that are playing a stronger role, like maybe in the Sri Lankan context, the South Asian, we had SARC back then, maybe in the Middle East, a similar body as well, which could be more effective as opposed to a global UN body?
Yeah, I see this very much in the African Union, where I've been working quite a lot in Africa for the last few years. And of course, the rise of the African Union is absolutely necessary. You're right that there is more pressure on these regional organizations to step in and be more effective. And I think that kind of decentralization of power is necessary because, again, the way in which the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, has operated is very much, even though China is in there and that there's various groups in there that come from the global south but do not have the ability to vote, is that it is very global north centric.
Right.
And the attitudes, even when you see the ICC in the past, it's very global north centric. And that's something that needs to be corrected, because the dominance of the global north, and the criticism of the ICC, for example, which is under the Rome Statute, the criticism of the International Criminal Court was it's fine to go and prosecute somebody in Africa, right? But at the moment it's something that is closer to the global north, that it would not almost adhere to them. We must also understand that the funding of these mechanisms comes often from the global north. Now, in the case of the US, what have they done against the ICC? Imagine, just in the case of the indictment of Netanyahu, is that the United States have actually sanctioned the members in the ICC. And it's basically rendering it almost incapable of doing business, because they're sanctioning the people inside the ICC and the ICC. So, Eswan, we're in a very strange place, not necessarily a good place, but we must look at ways to find, I guess, light in the tunnel here, and to hope that out of this comes something more representative of the world as we know it, that gives more power to members of the global south in the way in which we run our international global order, so to speak. So yeah, I would say I would like to see more decentralization to regional organizations, but and also just a more participatory role of the global south in all of these mechanisms.
Before wrapping up, I just want to also come back to I see reports of talk of a ceasefire being negotiated again in Gaza. The US is trying to play a bigger role there. Hamas is saying that there's not enough from what they're expecting from that ceasefire. Do you think ceasefires, I know, yes, it would help with the aid flow, but looking at both the Sri Lankan situation and successive other situations in other countries as well, since you played a key role in that ceasefire in Sri Lanka, have these really helped? Is there something more that needs to be done, some different system that needs to be looked at? Do these ceasefires, they seem to be temporary and never long-lasting?
So the problem, of course, is, and I think this is the problem in Gaza, in Palestine, is a 70-plus-year-old issue of displacement, forced displacement, and occupation. You will not solve that situation until you end that occupation. And after the conflict in Gaza now, I think it's inconceivable to imagine that you would have an actual ceasefire and then be able to do business as normal. But it's also inconceivable. The amount of slaughtering of innocent civilians in Gaza means that these two nations can never live side by side in one country. It's inconceivable. So this is why leaders have met most recently in Madrid. 20-odd nations have met in Madrid to prepare for a meeting in New York, which is now in the beginning of June, to talk about the two-state solution. But with what's happening right now, yes, there needs to be a ceasefire, because there is a famine. There is a famine because the aid structure that the Israelis and the US has put together, which is challenging the UN system, is not adequate. It is bogus. I'm sorry to say, it doesn't adhere to any kind of humanitarian principles. And what they're trying to do is actually corral people into one or two distribution points, which means that this is contributing to forced displacement of people in the zone. And the government, the genocidal intent, the ethnic cleansing intent here has been very much voiced by the leaders, in Israel, to say we want to clear the area of everybody. We want them to go to another country. So every indication of what's happening now in terms of, refusing to have the UN, which has UNRWA, the Palestinian, the organization that sort of takes care of the Palestinian refugees, it has 400 distribution points and 3,000 trucks waiting on the border, ready to go in. This is an attempt. Be under no illusion that this is an attempt by the Israelis to corral people into a very small area for forced displacement. Now, imagining this from I think in Sri Lanka, in that very small country, if those two nations are going to be living together in peace, and that we don't have a reoccurrence of violence, of people who may have had some kind of injustice at the time of the end of the conflict and beyond, is that the Sri Lankan justice system has to start, looking into those cases to provide some justice. Otherwise, a group of people that sense or feel injustice, that's a security issue for the long term. And so, yeah, I would say in the case of Israel and Palestine, the only solution now in that particular part of the world is a two-state solution, and I think everybody's realizing that. But what it does mean is that it needs 700,000 Jewish settlers to be dismantled, their settlements, and they cleared out of the West Bank. It's an enormous. It requires a peacekeeping operation in Gaza. It requires some kind of an interim authority like in Kosovo. This is a huge operation. We're a long way away from it, which is scary because people are dying in big numbers. But, with Sri Lanka, I'll just end on this, that if Sri Lanka wants to have peace, if Sri Lanka wants to have future peace, not risk having this kind of social eruption, it needs the justice system to acknowledge that atrocities were committed and that people need to see justice in their lifetime.
Thank you, Helen. It was really good talking to you. Thank you for your insights on the Gaza situation, of course, on Sri Lanka as well. Hopefully we'll have another discussion very soon.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for you for On Fire for this week. Till next time, stay safe.